Okay, so we're starting off on the respiratory system. If we look at our plans, we took our lymphatic and immune systems exam, at least if you were a senior, yesterday. So we're going to do 22 slides worth of notes today. Tomorrow's a work day. Remember, if you've not checked your email, that your outline for your term paper is due tomorrow at midnight. Okay. And then next week, we are just going to keep powering through the respiratory system. So let's jump in here, slides 1 through 22. I'm going to leave it like this so that I can see my notes down here that I like to have up when I do my presentations. Okay. So think about the respiratory system. What do you already know? What do you know about breathing? What do you know about taking in, breathing out? Usually think of taking in oxygen, but the air we breathe is actually 78% nitrogen roughly and only 21% oxygen. So that's interesting. Okay. And what we breathe out, we always say, well, we breathe out CO2, but that's only about 4% of what we breathe out. And we breathe out actually about 16% oxygen. So that's super interesting. Okay. So today we're going to talk about two pieces. We're going to do just a quick overview of the respiratory system. And then we're going to talk about a little bit of structure and function. Okay. So, first for the overview. The primary function of the respiratory system, we pretty much know, right? Breathing. Okay. But it does this by working with our blood supply to supply body cells with oxygen, right? Our blood comes through our lungs. We learned that with the cardiovascular system to pick up oxygen and exchange gases through capillaries. So, it exchanges respiratory gases like oxygen, nitrogen, CO2, all of that good stuff through the blood and with the external environment outside of the body. And then does this by working with our cardiovascular system. Okay. Specifically, when we're talking about gas exchange, we're focusing just on oxygen gas, that O2 gas, and CO2, carbon dioxide. Those are the two main gases that our respiratory system functions with because the cells of our body need a constant supply of oxygen, and then they also need to get rid of CO2. So our lungs, our respiratory system, and our cardiovascular system work hand in hand to accomplish this. Okay. The three major pieces of our respiratory systems include our airway, our lungs, and the muscles that operate the respiratory system. So, when I say airway, I mean the passageway that air comes into and leaves the body. So, your nose, your mouth, your windpipe, or your trachea, and the branches of it. Okay. The lungs, obviously, are the main organs where the gas exchange actually occurs between the blood and the outside world. And then the muscle that helps you breathe includes your diaphragm, and then your rib muscles, which push air into and out of your lungs. They're the things that help your lungs operate. They couldn't move that air throughout your body if it weren't for your diaphragm and your rib muscles. Okay. All right. So now let's talk about structures within your respiratory system and what they do. Okay, the organs that we will include in our respiratory system, and you will do a diagram later today, are your nasal cavity. Okay, so the cavity, the opening in your schnoz. Okay, your pharynx, and your larynx. So your pharynx, you can see, is right here. Okay, it's kind of a connection point before you get down here into your larynx, which is the top piece of your windpipe. Your trachea is your actual windpipe. Then you have your bronchi and your bronchioles. Bronchi is a plural word for bronchus. Okay, so that's what this word is here, this bronchus. Bronchi is just plural for that. Okay, and then your bronchioles are your branches and stuff within your lungs. So those are your main organs. Okay, there are pieces. We like to kind of piece our respiratory system apart to take better looks at it. And so the first piece we're going to talk about is the upper respiratory tract, okay, which we're talking about like our nasal cavity, our pharynx, and our larynx. Okay, so the nasal cavity is where air enters, um, and this is where air gets filtered, moistened, and warmed, okay, through your nasal cavity right here. Then it passes through the pharynx, which is right here, kind of where your throat and nose collide. Okay, and then your larynx, we tend to call it our voice box. It sits right on top of our trachea. Okay, so that's our upper respiratory tract. This is usually where sinus infections kind of start to affect. Upper respiratory tract infections usually occur within the nasal cavity, pharynx, and or larynx. Okay. Specifically talking about the nasal cavity, if we dive in a little bit um, more, okay, our nostrils, the technical term for that are the external nares, and this is where obviously air comes into or leaves your nasal cavity. Okay, then if you go inside of your nasal cavity up in here, you can divide it into two sides by your nasal septum. Remember, we talked about how your heart has a septum and so does your nose. Okay, so your septum divides your nasal cavity into two areas. Okay, they are your cavity is lined with ciliated mucosa. So ciliated are like the little hair-like projections that help move mucus throughout it. Um, the nasal conchae are projections are those ciliated mucosa, and they increase the surface area for warming the air and circulating the air, and increasing chances for those particles to be trapped by the mucous membranes in there. Okay, although air can enter the body through the mouth, it doesn't get filtered and warmed as well as if it comes through the nose. So if you are trying to get quality oxygen, that's why they tell you breathe through your nose, in through your nose, out through your mouth. Okay. Your nasal cavity is separated from your oral cavity, your mouth cavity, by your hard, bony palate. So if you push your tongue up against the roof of your mouth, that's your hard palate. And then back here, you can kind of push your tongue towards the back of your mouth. You'll feel when that hard palate switches into a soft palate. Okay, that is the deviation between your nasal cavity and your oral cavity. And then there's a network of thin walled veins that lies just under the surface of your nasal cavity, and that is how the air that comes in through your nose gets warmed up. Okay, lining your nasal cavity are ciliated mucosa, and so these hair-like projections help move the air through, which A warms the air up, and then B helps trap them in mucus. And the reason we want to do that is when we breathe in air, there's dust and mold and lots of things in the air, and we don't want all of that coming into our respiratory system. So the mucus in our nasal cavity helps trap the stuff that we don't want down there. And then the cilia pushes those things towards the pharynx where we can swallow them, or sometimes we can spit them back out, that kind of stuff to kind of help regulate what goes down through the trachea to the lungs. Okay, our pharynx is what we commonly call our throat. It's at the back, right behind the oral cavity, where the nasal cavity kind of runs into it. There are three pieces of the pharynx. Okay, the very tippy toppy, where it hasn't connected with the oral cavity yet, is called the nasopharynx because it only connects to the nasal cavity. And then there's the part right behind your oral cavity called the oropharynx. And then there's the bottom part just past the oral cavity called the laryngopharynx. Um, and these are, this one is sitting on top of the larynx, which is why it's called the laryngopharynx. Okay. Air gets diverted away from the esophagus. So if you remember, right, you have your esophagus. So when you eat food, your food comes through here, and then you have right here, you can either push food down through your esophagus, or you can push air down through your larynx. And how do you stop air from getting into the esophagus? Well, there is a little structure called the epiglottis that stops air from flowing through your esophagus and instead goes through your larynx. Okay, so your epiglottis is just a flexible flap of cartilage. You can think of it almost like a valve, and it just sits at the top end of the larynx right here. Okay, so here's your larynx, right, and then here's your esophagus coming down this way. When we eat food, we want it to come down here because we want it to go to our stomach, but we do not want food going to our lungs. So how do we deal with that? The epiglottis. Okay, so the epiglottis, when we swallow, bends downward and it covers that opening. Okay, which stops food from going through our airway and allows food and liquids to enter the esophagus. Okay, the relaxed position of the epiglottis is open, which is shown here. which lets air into and out of our lower respiratory tract, which is our lungs. Okay, if anything other than air enters the larynx, we start to cough. We have to cough it back up. Okay, so one thing that I usually have you do is if you put your hand over your throat and you swallow, you should be able to feel your larynx rise up, and that it was is what causes the epiglottis, that flap, to bend downward and stop food from going into your lungs. Okay. All right, now we have our larynx. We've talked about the upper respiratory tract. Now we have the larynx. Okay, the larynx is what we commonly call our voice box. You can feel it vibrate when you talk. Okay, it is just below the pharynx, which we just talked about, and it has 8 little pieces of hard cartilage. Okay, and inside of that cartilage, you can kind of see them right here in the darker gray, are our vocal cords. Okay, you also may hear this called the Adam's apple in men, just because the larynx for men tends to be larger than it is for women. It's not an extra structure, it's the same thing, it's just it tends to be larger in males than it is in females. Okay, the larynx surrounds your vocal cords, and basically, your vocal cords is just a pair of folded membranes. Um, and we call them the vocal cords. And when we move air through and around them, they vibrate. And if you took physics, you would know that vibrations cause particles in the air to move, which creates sound. So here are a couple of diagrams. When we are breathing, the glottis is open, and when we are speaking, it's closed and vibrating and creating sound. Okay. Now we're going to hit our lower respiratory tract. So our lower respiratory tract includes our trachea, our bronchi, and our lungs. Okay, so air goes through your nasal cavity, through your pharynx and your voice box, your larynx, and then it hits your trachea. Trachea is what we usually call our windpipe, and that trachea divides into 2 branches, which we call the bronchi or the bronchus, the 2 primary bronchi, and one enters each of your lungs. Your lungs then are filled with tiny little sacs, air sacs, and those sacs are the places where the air gets exchanged with the environment. So if we focus just on the windpipe for a second, okay, it's anterior, so it's in front of the esophagus. They run right next to each other, but the trachea is more forward than the esophagus is. It's about 10 to 12 centimeters long, and 1 inch is about 2.5 centimeters, so 4 or 5 inches long. It's not super long. Okay, it's supported by C-shaped rings of cartilage. That's what these are. They're not bone, but it is cartilage. Okay, and the function of that cartilage is to hold the trachea open when you're breathing deeply. So think about like when you're sleeping and you're breathing really deeply, those rigid cartilage rings help hold that membrane open. Okay. Um, and think about why they're C-shaped instead of like total rings. Well, you have the esophagus, which food travels down running just behind the trachea. So what happens if there's a little bit of room here? What can happen is when we swallow and we push food down the esophagus, if this was just rigid cartilage, that esophagus couldn't expand to hold the food. But since there's a little bit of room and it can kind of push in that space because these rings are just C shaped, then when we swallow, our esophagus can expand and kind of touch our trachea. Okay. Um, then we have ciliated epithelial or skin cells that line the trachea, and that contributes to cleansing incoming air. Okay, so basically, the purpose of those ciliated with the little hairs, okay, these epithelial cells with cilia on them, the purpose of those is to cleanse and warm and humidify the air that comes through the trachea and into the bronchi of the lungs. Okay, so think about it. You have these in your nasal cavity. So when the air comes into your nasal cavity, it gets warmed, cleansed, humidified, and then it travels down through the larynx and it gets warmed, cleansed, and humidified again. Your body is really trying to clear the air of dangerous particulates before it gets to your lungs. Okay, and after it travels into your trachea is going to divide into what we call the right and left primary bronchi. Okay, so those are just these 2 branches you can see with the rings that it continues down, okay, into the 2 branches. These are the bronchi. A single one is called a bronchus, but two of them are called bronchi. Okay, the right bronchus is wider, shorter, and straighter than the left one. So it's more common actually for foreign objects to become lodged on the right side of the lungs than it is for the left, just because the right tube is a little bit bigger. Okay, the primary bronchi then divide again. You can see within the lungs that they divide again into secondary bronchi, and then they divide again into tertiary bronchi until they start looking like branches on a tree. Okay, when they get really, really, really small, like less than 1 millimeter in diameter, we call these bronchioles. And then all of the branches up to the bronchioles are reinforced with cartilage. And then the bronchioles, they're really, really small. So instead of being reinforced with cartilage, they are reinforced with kind of elastic-like fibers. But basically, what happens is all of these branching passageways, sorry, my dogs are being a pain, form a network that we sometimes call the bronchial tree because it looks like a tree. And that network allows air to get evenly throughout the lungs. Speaking of the lungs, okay, the lungs themselves are spongy and soft, okay, and they're big. I don't know if you've ever seen lungs, but they're large, okay, and they're very soft and spongy and squishy. So basically, what happens is your entire thoracic cavity, except for the mediastinum, that little area where your heart is your lungs. Okay, the entire thoracic cavity, except for the little spot where your heart is your lungs. Um, and each lung has lobes. So your right lung, which is on the left side of this picture, has three lobes. Okay, you have your superior lobe because it's on the top, you have your middle lobe because it's in the middle, and you have your inferior lobe because it's on the bottom. Your left lung, which is on the right side, is only divided into two lobes, your superior and inferior lobe. Okay. Um, let's see. So then we have some membranes. Okay, the surface of each lung is covered by a serous membrane, so a fluid membrane, called the visceral pleura. The parietal pleura lines the thoracic cavity. So the cavity that holds your lungs is lined by a membrane called the parietal pleura. And then the lungs themselves are lined by a membrane called the visceral pleura. Okay. And then if we look at the parts and pieces of the lungs, the narrow upper part of each lung is called the apex. So it's kind of like a point up here. That's the apex of each lung. Okay. And then the broad, like bottom portion is called the base, right down here. It's the part that sits on the diaphragm muscle. Okay. And then these serous membranes, the visceral pleura, are the ones that are secreting fluid. And the reason that we want to secrete fluid on the surface of our lungs is because when your lungs are inflating and deflating within the cavity, they're moving a lot, and that can cause friction. And that fluid that the membranes secrete can help stop that friction from causing problems or discomfort. Okay. And then we talked about how the bronchi branch and branch and branch and branch, right? And I mean, they get really, really tiny. So the very end, those bronchioles are really, really small, like less than half of a millimeter in diameter. And so those ones at the very end are called terminal bronchioles. And they lead into respiratory bronchioles, and they end in these clusters of air sacs. And you can see these air sacs in this picture. One individual air sac is called an alveolus, and multiples are called alveoli. And this is where the gas exchange happens. They are surrounded. You can see here that there are capillaries. Remember, where the blood is flowing and gas exchange happens, just nested all around the alveoli. Okay. Um, the terminal bronchioles lead into respiratory zone structures. So you have the respiratory bronchial zone, the alveolar duct zone, the alveolar sac zone, and the alveoli. So an alveoli is a group like this of these alveolus. Okay. One group is called an alveoli, and then there's a bunch of capillaries that kind of hold them together. The respiratory bronchioles are continuous with the alveolar ducts, so the end of this bronchus just keeps moving. Like there's no stop, there's no gateway, just keeps moving into the ducts of the alveolus. Okay, and then those alveolus ducts the alveolar ducts lead into an alveolus, which comes into the sac, which looks like a cluster of grapes, which we call an alveoli. Okay. Alveolar sacs are composed of individual alveoli, which looks like just a single grape. Okay. So that's where the gas exchange happens. And if we look at an alveoli a little bit more closely, the thin walled air sacs that make up the bulk of the lung tissue, that's the technical term for your alveoli. So when I give you your key term sheet on Monday, that is the definition of an alveoli, a thin walled air sac that makes up the bulk of lung tissue. Okay, and this is where gas exchange happens. This is where the oxygen and the carbon dioxide are exchanged through the blood by simple diffusion through the capillaries through the respiratory membrane. Okay, so you can see here you've got your capillaries, you've got your arterioles, which will connect up to an artery, and they're connecting into the venules, which will connect up to a vein. All of this we learned in the cardiovascular system, and they're wrapped around the alveoli. Okay, the air will come down through the trachea, then through the bronchi, and branch into these terminal bronchioles, and then the air will travel through the alveolar ducts into the alveoli. When it gets into the alveoli, that thin membrane on the outside, the respiratory membrane, is touching the capillaries. And remember, the capillaries are really, really thin. Okay, so this blood in the red arterioles is coming in and it's delivering this oxygen. It's picking up this, or sorry, the blue blood is coming in and it's picking up the oxygen from the alveoli. And then it's going back up through the arteriole to get pumped out to the rest of the body by the heart. Okay. There are between 300 and 500 million alveoli in your lungs. So your lungs are mostly air spaces. Okay. Most of the tissue, if you were to take out your lungs and weigh them, most of the tissue mass would come from the alveoli. What happens is the oxygen passes from the alveoli air, so the air that comes down through everything into the alveolar sacs, into the capillary blood, and then the carbon dioxide diffuses out of the blood and comes into the alveoli. So the alveoli gets rid of the oxygen and pushes it into the blood, and the blood gets rid of the CO2 and pushes that into the alveoli. So then the gases move passively from areas of high concentration to low concentration. So if there's a bunch of CO2 in here, it's going to get forced back out into the lungs. And then your diaphragm is going to expand, which makes your lungs contract and push the CO2 out of you. And that's how breathing works. On a very large or basic ish scale, that's how breathing works. Okay, and that's it. That's all we're going to start with today. That was the overview and then the structure and function of the pieces of your respiratory system. So what you're going to do now, you should have been taking notes. Your notes were emailed to you at 8 a.m. this morning. So now there is a diagram that's being handed out, I believe. Yeah. And it's just the basic diagram. It's got the upper and lower respiratory tract. And then next week, I have some diagram of alveoli for us to work with. So you're going to finish that diagram, and then you'll have time to work on your outline, which is due tomorrow at midnight. If you need any help or need me to go over anything, just shoot me an email. Other than that, have a fantastic day, and I will see all of you next week.